At a sunlit cafe nestled in the heart of Charleston, a wealthy businessman sits across from his elegant young wife, unaware that their quiet lunch is moments away from unraveling. Outside the gate, a hungry teenage boy watches from the sidewalk, just another face the world chooses not to see. But when he witnesses something no one else notices, something dangerous, something meant to kill, he's faced with a choice that could cost him everything. He steps forward alone and shaking into a world that doesn't welcome him to speak the truth no one wants to hear. What begins as an ordinary meal becomes a battle between silence and courage, deception, and justice seen through the eyes of the least expected hero. This story is a reminder that sometimes the smallest voice in the room is the only one brave enough to save a life. If you believe quiet strength still matters, stay with us. This is one you won't want to miss. It was just past noon when the light filtered softly through the white awnings of the Laurel Garden, a quiet cafe tucked beneath the shade of tall magnolia trees in the heart of Charleston. The hum of polite conversation mixed with the clinking of cutlery, and somewhere in the background, a violin version of an old jazz classic drifted through the speakers. Waiters moved fluidly between marble-top tables, their uniforms crisp, their expressions trained to be invisible. It was the kind of place where time slowed down just enough to let the wealthy pretend the rest of the world didn't exist. At a prime corner table, Stephen Jones sat with the kind of presence that did not need to be announced. He was in his early 70s, but carried himself with the confidence of someone who still owned every room he entered. His silver hair was neatly combed, and his tailored navy suit looked freshly pressed even in the midday warmth. A discreet Bluetooth earpiece sat in his ear, and every few minutes he tapped at his phone with the steady rhythm of someone used to making decisions worth millions. Stephen Jones wasn't retired. He didn't believe in slowing down. In fact, even now, during what was supposed to be lunch, he was fielding calls from his legal team, approving a construction deal in Atlanta, and making mental notes about the quarterly earnings call scheduled for next week. Across from him sat Jessie, his wife of nearly 6 years. She was in her mid-30s, elegant in a silk blouse the color of bone china, her dark hair falling in a sleek wave to one side. Her makeup was flawless, her nails painted a soft nude pink that matched her lipstick, but her eyes held a restlessness that betrayed her poise. She stirred her coffee slowly, not because she wanted to drink it, but because it gave her something to do, while Stephen remained locked in conversation with someone on the other side of his world. "I thought we agreed no calls during lunch," she said gently, her voice light, not quite accusing. Stephen glanced up briefly, but didn't smile. "This won't take long," he replied before turning his gaze back to the screen. She looked away, biting the inside of her cheek, then reached for her phone and scrolled with an expression that didn't belong in a peaceful cafe. She didn't sigh or roll her eyes. She had trained herself not to, but her jaw tightened slightly, and she drummed her fingers against the napkin in her lap. It wasn't anger, not really. It was something quieter, something more tired. Just outside the cafe's low iron fence, a boy stood motionless under the sun, his back pressed against the brick wall like he was trying not to be noticed. His name was Ryder. He looked about 13, though hunger had made him small for his age. His hoodie was several sizes too big and stained at the sleeves, his jeans frayed and faded. He wore shoes that looked like they had walked through too many nights, and he had the kind of sharp, scanning eyes that came from learning to read danger and opportunity in equal measure. Ryder wasn't watching the people. He was watching the food. His gaze landed on Stephen's table, particularly on the dish placed gently before him. Minutes earlier, a bowl of tomato bisque garnished with a swirl of cream and fresh herbs. Next to it sat a basket of warm rolls and a tall glass of sparkling water that caught the sun in a dozen tiny reflections. Ryder didn't breathe for a second. His stomach tightened in on itself like it was trying to shrink out of embarrassment. He'd gone without eating plenty of times, but something about today, something about that meal so close, yet so untouchable, felt like a dare. A server approached the table and refilled Stephen's water with a polite nod. Jessie offered a thin smile, but it faded as soon as the waiter walked away. Stephen finally ended his call, exhaling through his nose like someone finishing a chore. "You've barely said a word," Jessie said quietly. "I'm here," he answered not unkindly. "Isn't that what matters?" She stared at him, her mouth half open like she had something to say, but couldn't quite decide whether it was worth it. Then just as quickly she leaned back and lifted her own glass of water, her earrings catching the sun. Across the fence, Ryder edged closer. He wasn't sure why he didn't just walk away. He had before. He'd seen people eat things he hadn't tasted in months, seen couples in suits and dresses laugh like everything was fine. But this time, something held him in place. Jessie, still silent, reached down into her handbag that rested casually beside her chair. Her fingers moved with care, not hurried, but purposeful. She pulled something small and clear from inside a vial, no longer than her pinky finger. For a second, she glanced up. Stephen was looking at his phone again, distracted, absorbed. She turned slightly in her seat to shield her motion, popped the cap, and tilted the vial gently over the soup. The liquid disappeared instantly into the creamy surface without a ripple. Jessie's face did not change. She stirred the soup delicately like a woman preparing a romantic lunch. Her spoon made a soft clicking sound against the porcelain. Ryder blinked hard. Had he really seen that? He took a step back, heart beginning to race. His hands felt suddenly cold despite the warm air. Maybe he imagined it. Maybe it was nothing. But something in her face, the stillness, the blankness, didn't sit right. It was like watching someone rehearse being human. Then Jessie leaned forward and said, barely above a whisper, "You always forget your own schedule, Stephen. I'll make sure you don't miss your next meeting." Ryder's breath caught. His instincts screamed that he had seen something real, something dangerous. Stephen put down his phone and adjusted his glasses. "You said something," he asked casually. Jessie smiled. "Just reminding you to eat. It'll get cold." Stephen reached for the spoon, oblivious. Ryder, frozen behind the fence, watched as the man lifted the spoon, swirling it once before pausing. He wasn't sure what he had witnessed, but every part of him knew it wasn't right. His heart pounded harder. He looked around. No one was paying attention. People were eating, laughing, tapping at their own phones. It was like Ryder didn't exist, but that soup did, and so did what he saw. He should walk away. He knew that. What would happen if he barged into that world? Who would believe him? He was just a kid in a stained hoodie standing outside a place that clearly wasn't meant for him, but was about to eat. Ryder felt his stomach clench, not from hunger this time, but from fear. And still, his feet stayed rooted to the ground. Ryder didn't move right away. He stood frozen behind the black iron fence, his breath caught in his chest, like it didn't know whether to rise or fall. His eyes stayed locked on the bowl of soup sitting untouched in front of the man across the table, the one everyone else seemed to know by name, title, and reputation, Stephen Jones. The sparkle of cream on the surface of the tomato bisque still swirled, gently disturbed only by Jessie's spoon moments earlier. Ryder could still see her fingers in his mind, calm, precise, graceful, in a way that didn't match what she had just done. There was no tremor, no hesitation, not even the subtle panic of someone doing something they shouldn't. She had moved like someone who had practiced this before, and that, more than anything, made Ryder's stomach twist. He stepped back from the fence, slowly trying to breathe. The buzz of lunchtime conversation resumed behind him, as if nothing had happened, as if the whole world hadn't just teetered for a second on something terribly wrong. He found himself near a large planter along the sidewalk and lowered himself to sit behind it, pulling his knees in close. His fingers rubbed against the frayed seams of his hoodie, as if the texture could anchor him in the moment. What he'd seen wasn't normal. He knew that, but saying something that was different, that was dangerous. He looked at the cafe again. The tables were full of people in pressed shirts and flowing dresses, their sunglasses expensive and their laughter soft. No one was paying attention to the man and woman at the corner table now. No one had seen what Ryder had seen, or maybe they just didn't care. He had learned early that adults liked to pretend things were fine as long as the setting looked good enough. It wasn't the first time he'd seen something he wasn't supposed to see, but this time felt different. This wasn't shoplifting. This wasn't some guy yelling in the street. This was something real. This could kill someone. But then again, who was he to say anything? He didn't even belong inside that place. The few times he had wandered too close to cafes like this, someone would step in front of him, arms crossed, eyes hard. They didn't need to raise their voices. A look was enough to tell him he wasn't welcome. Once a woman had told him flat out to keep moving before she called security. She hadn't asked his name. She hadn't asked if he was okay. She had looked at his skin, his clothes, and decided everything she needed to know. Ryder wasn't naive. He knew what people saw when they looked at him. Poor. Trouble. possibly dangerous. So how in the world would they believe him now? That woman inside had pearls around her neck. He had dirt under his fingernails. Still, the image kept coming back, the small vial, her hand, the way her voice had dropped when she leaned toward her husband. The words had been so quiet, yet so pointed, like a thread pulled tight under the surface of the conversation. "I'll make sure you don't miss your next meeting." That wasn't something people said unless there was more to it. Ryder's chest started to ache with tension. He felt it pressing between his ribs, asking if he was going to walk away again. His eyes flicked toward the plate, toward the spoon that had just begun to lift. He stood up. He didn't know how his legs started moving, but they did. One step, then another, then through the gate he wasn't supposed to cross. The moment he passed the threshold, he felt the weight of every stare. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Forks hung mid-air. The crisp, curated quiet of the Laurel Garden fractured under the sound of worn sneakers hitting the stone walkway. Stephen looked up first, his brow furrowed, not in anger yet, but in confusion. Jessie turned next, her eyes narrowing just slightly, her lips parting in what seemed like surprise, though Ryder thought he caught something else in that look. Annoyance, maybe, or calculation. She stood halfway before he even opened his mouth. "Don't eat that," Ryder said louder than he expected. His voice cracked, but he didn't back down. "Please, don't eat the soup." For a moment, no one said anything. A fork clattered against a plate somewhere in the back. Then a man at a nearby table muttered something under his breath. A woman across the patio shifted uncomfortably and tightened her grip on her purse. Jessie's face tightened. "Excuse me," she asked sharply. Stephen set his spoon down, still not touching the bowl. "What did you just say?" "I saw her," Ryder said, trying to steady his breathing. "She put something in your soup. I swear I saw her do it." Jessie gave a short laugh, cold and quick. "This is ridiculous. Who even let him in here?" Ryder's heart was pounding now. His voice was shaky, but he kept speaking. "She had a bottle. Small. Clear. She poured it in when you were looking at your phone." Jessie looked at Stephen, then back at the people, now staring in open curiosity. Her tone shifted smoother now, almost sweet. "He's obviously confused," she said. "Poor kid. Probably hungry. Maybe looking for attention." "I'm not lying," Ryder insisted. "You can check. You can smell it if you want." Stephen didn't speak right away. He just studied Ryder for a long moment, his eyes unreadable. His phone still sat on the table beside his hand, but he didn't reach for it. Jessie placed her palm on her husband's arm and leaned in. "Stephen," she said softly, "this is nonsense. Let's just get our food packed to go. I've lost my appetite." But Stephen didn't move. His fingers tapped lightly against the side of the spoon. The color had drained slightly from his face, though his expression remained composed. Ryder saw it, the tension around his mouth, the way his eyes didn't meet Jessie's, the same way they had before. "Where did you come from?" son Stephen asked. "From over there," Ryder said, nodding toward the fence. "I was standing by the street. I didn't mean to get involved, but I saw her do it. I wouldn't be here if I hadn't." A soft murmur rose from the crowd. No one was eating anymore. A few patrons were already holding their phones up, recording quietly. Stephen exhaled slowly. His hand moved toward the bowl again, then stopped. "Jessie," he said calmly, "is there something I need to know?" Her face changed again, and this time the warmth in her expression faded entirely. She straightened her shoulders and looked Stephen dead in the eye. "This is absurd," she snapped. "You're actually giving this kid the time of day. He could be anyone. He's not even supposed to be in here." "I know what I saw," Ryder repeated louder this time. "You can check the soup, have someone test it, call someone. Just don't eat it." Jessie turned sharply toward him. "How dare you accuse me of something so disgusting? Do you even know who this man is?" Stephen remained seated, but now he was watching Jessie with a calm, sharp focus. He didn't look confused anymore. He looked like a man trying to fit together pieces he hadn't noticed were broken. Ryder stayed where he was, feet planted, heart thudding. He didn't expect to be believed, but he wasn't going to take it back. Then Stephen spoke again, this time without looking at either of them. "Can someone get the manager, please?" His voice was quiet, but it carried weight. People began moving. A server rushed off. Jessie took a step back. Her eyes were wider now, her breathing more shallow. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. Ryder didn't know what was going to happen next, but for the first time since he stepped inside, he didn't feel invisible. And Stephen Jones, a man who had never once noticed him before today, wasn't ignoring him anymore. The tension in the air was thick enough to feel. It clung to every surface, every glance, every pause in conversation. No one at the Laurel Garden was eating anymore. Plates sat untouched, drinks sat sweating in the sun, and all eyes had quietly, almost magnetically turned toward the corner table where Stephen Jones sat, his hand hovering just inches from the soup he had yet to taste. Across from him, Jessie stood stiffly, her hand still lightly resting on his shoulder, though there was nothing affectionate in the touch. Her expression had tightened not with fear, but with something sharper, something calculated, and just a few feet away, Ryder stood in plain view. His shoulders rigid, his fists clenched at his sides, his voice still trembling from the words he had just spoken. No one spoke for several seconds. The quiet didn't feel like silence, it felt like a warning. Then Stephen slowly lowered the spoon to the edge of the plate and turned slightly in his chair, looking up at Ryder with an expression that wasn't confusion anymore. It was caution, curiosity, calculation. "You said she poured something in it," he said, his tone even measured. "Are you sure that's what you saw?" Ryder nodded. "Yes, sir. I was standing by the fence. She took something from her bag, poured it in when you weren't looking. It was clear. A little bottle. She stirred it right after." Stephen's eyes didn't leave Ryder's face. He studied him, not harshly, but with the kind of precision that came from years of negotiating deals, reading people, deciding which truths were worth believing. Behind him, Jessie gave a soft laugh, short and sharp, the kind meant to deflect and draw attention back to her. "Stephen, this is absurd. He's just a kid. Probably hasn't eaten in days. Maybe he saw a reflection in the soup and got confused, or maybe he's making it up for attention. It's not like people like that haven't pulled stunts for money before." Her voice didn't rise, but the shift was clear. People like that. The phrase hung in the air, unacknowledged, but undeniable. Ryder flinched slightly, not from the words themselves, but from the way they were said. Flat, dismissive, as if he were an object, not a person. He felt the weight of every eye on him, judging not just what he said, but who he was. He took a small breath, then stepped closer. "I don't want anything. I didn't come here for money. I'm not lying. I saw what she did. If someone tested it, you'd know." Stephen turned his gaze back to Jessie. Her smile was gone now. In its place was a tight line across her lips, her arms crossed just a bit too firmly. She wasn't playing gentle anymore. "Stephen," she said, the edge in her voice now unmistakable, "you've worked your whole life to build something real. You've seen people try to take it. You know how they work, playing on sympathy, sneaking in through the cracks. Are you really going to let this story make you question me after everything?" Her eyes were glinting now. She looked around at the patrons watching her and lowered her voice just enough to sound fragile. "This is humiliating, and it's not even true. He doesn't know us. He's just some kid who probably thinks he can get a free meal by scaring a rich man." Ryder felt the words hit him like a shove. He could hear the murmurs now, a few people whispering to each other, not all of it friendly. "They'll believe her," he thought for a split second. "She looks the part. I don't." But he didn't back down. He swallowed hard and met Stephen's eyes again. "Please, don't let how I look decide if I'm telling the truth." That landed heavier than he expected. Stephen blinked slowly. His jaw tensed. He leaned back in his chair, hands on the table, now fingers pressing lightly into the surface. His voice was calm, but lower than before. "Jessie, where's your purse?" Jessie's expression barely flickered, but she hesitated half a beat too long. "Why does that matter? Because he said you took something from it," Stephen replied, "and right now, I want to see for myself." Jessie shook her head with a short, sharp movement. "Absolutely not. This is ridiculous. I don't have to let you rifle through my things because of some kid's fantasy." Stephen looked at her carefully, and then his voice dropped even lower. "You're not answering the question. Where is it?" She shifted slightly, her hand tightening around the handle of her bag that now sat by her chair. Stephen reached for it, not abruptly, just enough to make her step back. "Don't," she said, quickly, too quickly. "You don't get to treat me like a criminal." Ryder didn't move. He didn't dare. The entire cafe was watching now, people frozen with anticipation, some with phones lifted halfway, unsure if it was appropriate to record, but unable to resist. The energy had changed completely. This was no longer a strange interruption. It was a standoff. Stephen stood up slowly. The movement was quiet, deliberate. He wasn't tall, but he stood like someone used to being heard. He looked down at the bowl of soup, then up at his wife. "I asked you a simple question. Now I need a straight answer." Jessie's mouth opened, but the words didn't come. She looked at Ryder, then at Stephen, then finally at the onlookers around them. Her voice, when it came, was smaller than before. "You're siding with him." Stephen didn't reply. He just watched her. The silence between them said more than words could have. She turned toward Ryder, her face shifting into something colder, sharper. "Do you even know who he is?" she asked, her voice rising just enough to carry. "Do you think you're going to walk in here, say something like this, and ruin a man like Stephen Jones?" "I'm not trying to ruin anyone," Ryder said quietly but firmly. "I'm trying to stop something before it happens." Jesse scoffed. "You don't know anything. You don't know me." "You're right," Ryder replied, "but I saw what I saw. And if I didn't say anything and something happened to him, that would have been on me." That silenced even the murmurs. The cafe was dead quiet again. Stephen's hand hovered briefly over his chair, then dropped to his side. His eyes were no longer just skeptical. They were searching, trying to match the woman in front of him with the woman he thought he married. He didn't say anything else. Instead, he turned toward the waiter, who had been standing awkwardly by the entrance to the patio, not knowing whether to intervene. "Call someone," Stephen said. "Have the soup tested." Jesse's mouth dropped open. "You're serious?" Stephen nodded. Dead serious. Jesse's face tightened, her eyes darting for a moment, maybe toward an exit, maybe toward an excuse. But nothing came. The weight of the moment bore down on her, and for the first time since Ryder stepped inside, she had nothing to say. The waiter turned and walked briskly inside. Stephen sat down again slowly, his gaze fixed not on his wife, not on the soup, but on Ryder, who still stood silently near the table, his chest rising and falling with the rhythm of someone trying not to panic. "You did the right thing," Stephen said quietly. Ryder didn't smile. He couldn't. Not yet. Not until the truth came out. But something in Stephen's voice gave him a reason to stay right where he was. The moment Stephen Jones instructed the waiter to have the soup, tested the fragile tension that had been gripping the cafe, finally cracked. It didn't shatter loudly, not yet, but it shifted everything. The atmosphere turned dense like a pressure system had moved in. Conversations that had been hushed now vanished entirely, replaced by an eerie stillness, as if everyone was holding their breath. The waiter, a young man in his 20s with a neat apron and nervous eyes, nodded quickly and turned away, retreating into the building without another word. The sound of the kitchen door swinging shut behind him echoed more than it should have. Jessie didn't move at first. Her hand was still on the handle of her purse, fingers clenched tighter than she realized. She blinked once slowly, then looked at Stephen with a forced expression that tried for calm but didn't reach her eyes. "You really think this is necessary?" she said, her voice lower now, almost strained. "This is embarrassing, Stephen." Stephen didn't answer right away. His eyes remained fixed on her, not harsh, not angry, but sharp and alert in a way that said he wasn't brushing this aside. He had built an empire by noticing small things that other people missed. And right now her reaction, not just the words, but the timing, the tone the body language was telling him, more than she probably realized. "Yes," he said simply, "I do." That one sentence made Jessie's expression falter. She blinked again, tighter this time, as if holding something back. "This is insane," she said louder now. A few patrons flinched at the shift in her voice. "You're listening to a street kid over your wife Stephen. You've known him for 30 seconds, and you're letting him make decisions for you." Ryder didn't say anything. He stayed where he was, hands by his sides, shoulders tight, trying to steady his breathing. His heart still pounded, but he wasn't going to interrupt. Not now. Not when Stephen was this close to seeing it for himself. Stephen took a small step back, just enough to put space between himself and Jessie. Not aggressive, not defensive, just a quiet act of separation. "I haven't made any decisions," he said. "I'm asking questions." Jessie let out a laugh that sounded more like a scoff. "No," she said, her tone turning cold. "You're treating me like a suspect. You're acting like I did something wrong just because some stray kid needed attention today." One of the nearby patrons, a woman in a navy blazer and pearls, whispered something to the man next to her. Her phone was out now, camera pointed discreetly toward the table. Others followed suit. The quiet click of recording buttons became a soft, scattered chorus. Stephen glanced at Jessie's purse again. "Then open the bag," he said. "If there's nothing in there, this ends here." "No," Jessie snapped. Her voice cut through the patio like a whip. "You don't get to demand that." Stephen's expression didn't change, but his voice did. It lost its softness. "I think I do." Jessie stepped back. Her face was flushed now, her jaw clenched so tightly the muscles in her neck twitched. "You think I'm stupid," she said, her voice rising again. "You think I don't see what this is. You haven't looked at me properly in months. You cancel dinners. You sleep in your office. You treat me like I'm part of the furniture. And now the first chance you get, you choose some kid over me. Over your wife." Stephen remained still, but his hands were no longer resting. One now gripped the edge of the table, knuckles pale. "I'm not choosing anyone," he said. "I'm trying to understand what's happening." Jesse laughed again, a bitter, breathless sound. "You're not trying to understand. You're trying to blame. You want this to be about me because you don't want to admit that you built your whole life and you're still alone." Stephen looked at her for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft. "You know what hurts?" he asked. "You didn't deny it. Not once." That stopped Jesse. For a split second, her expression cracked. Something behind her eyes gave way. And then she exploded. "Fine," she shouted. "You want honesty. You want the truth. I'm tired of being invisible. I'm tired of living with a man who thinks money is the same as love. You were never supposed to be around this long. I had a plan. I was going to be free. I deserve that." The words rang out across the patio, followed by silence. So complete it seemed like even the breeze had paused. A glass shattered in the distance somewhere inside the kitchen. Jesse's chest was heaving now, her face red, her hands trembling as they gripped the edge of the table. Stephen stared at her. He didn't speak. He didn't move. His face had gone pale, but his eyes stayed fixed on hers, unwavering. The betrayal settled into his features slowly, like a shadow crossing over water. Ryder stood frozen. He didn't feel relief, not yet. The moment was too raw, too sharp. Jessie wasn't crying. She wasn't begging. She was just breathing hard, glaring, daring anyone to say something. Behind them, the waiter returned with a manager and 2 security staff. The manager, a man in his 40s with a calm demeanor, stepped forward carefully. "Mr. Jones," he said quietly, "do you need us to call the authorities?" Stephen looked at Jesse, then at the untouched bowl of soup, then at Ryder. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Yes," he said, "call them." Jesse's eyes darted toward the entrance as the waiter disappeared to make the call. Her posture stiffened, jaw locked in place, as if she could hold the moment back through sheer will. Stephen remained standing beside the table, watching her with a stillness that wasn't passive, it was waiting. His shoulders didn't move, his gaze didn't flicker. If there had been any doubt lingering in his mind, it was no longer fighting for space. The truth was unraveling in front of him, one thread at a time, and all he had to do now was let it go. Jessie turned to him slowly, and her voice dropped low. "You're really doing this. You're letting them drag me out of here for what for? That kid's word over mine." Stephen said nothing. The words weren't hitting him the way she wanted them to. His expression wasn't cruel or vengeful. It was tired, deeply heartbreakingly tired. Ryder stayed rooted just a few steps back, eyes locked on both of them. He could feel his palms sweating, his stomach tight. A part of him wished he could vanish. Another part, the one that had made him speak up in the first place, refused to look away. Then came the sound of sirens. Not loud at first, but clear. They cut through the muted whispers of the patio like a bell tolling at the end of something important. A minute later, 2 officers entered through the open gate, scanning the cafe with the kind of calm authority that came from experience. One was tall, mid-40s, steady in movement. The other younger, alert, but cautious. They approached the table, hands resting on their belts, but not yet reaching for anything. "Afternoon," the older officer said, addressing Stephen first. "We were told there's been a potential poisoning." Stephen nodded once. "This boy says he witnessed my wife put something into my food without my knowledge." Jesse's face hardened instantly. "He's lying," she snapped. "I don't know what he thinks he saw, but it's not true." The younger officer looked at Ryder. "You saw her put something into the food." "Yes, sir," Ryder said, voice steady, despite the nerves that ran through his whole body. "She took a bottle out of her purse and poured something in when he wasn't looking." Jesse let out a laugh that was closer to a bark. "This is insane. I don't even know where he came from. I've never seen him in my life." The older officer raised his hand gently, signaling for calm. "Ma'am, is there anything you'd like to say before we take a look at the food and the contents of your bag?" Jessie froze. It was only for a second, but it was enough. Her shoulders lifted slightly, her chest tightening as if she couldn't breathe right. Then she exploded. "You don't understand," she said, her voice shaking with sudden fury. "I gave him everything. I stood by him through every meeting, every trip, every damned foundation dinner, while he worked 18 hours a day and barely remembered I existed. You think that's a marriage? You think this life is easy?" He hasn't said a real thing to me in months. He hasn't touched me, hasn't asked me what I want, what I need. I'm just decoration at this point, a placeholder, a trophy he forgot to polish." Stephen didn't interrupt her. He didn't flinch. His face had gone blank. Not cold, not angry, just empty, as if something had quietly died behind his eyes. Jesse's voice cracked. "You want to know why? Because I couldn't take it anymore. Because I couldn't keep waking up every day next to someone who doesn't see me. Someone who made me small so he could stay big. I didn't mean for it to happen like this, but it's not like you were going to just go. You never would. You would have lived forever out of spite just to ignore me." The words spilled out faster than she could pull them back. Her breathing turned ragged. The officers exchanged glances. One of them quietly reached for a small notepad. The younger one leaned toward the table, eyes scanning the soup and Jesse's purse. Stephen finally spoke, his voice like sandpaper. "You didn't mean for it to happen like this." It wasn't a question. It was a quiet echo of her own words, and it hung in the air with unbearable weight. Jesse stared at him, eyes rimmed red, but not from tears. She wasn't crying. She didn't have it in her anymore. "You don't know what it's like," she said, her voice lower, more raw. "To give up everything for someone who won't even look at you. I spent years pretending to be happy so you wouldn't feel guilty, but I wasn't. I was alone long before today." Stephen nodded slowly, just once, his jaw tensed. "And so your answer was to poison me." She didn't respond. The older officer stepped forward. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to place your bag on the table and keep your hands where we can see them." Jesse hesitated, then threw the bag down with more force than necessary. The younger officer opened it carefully. Inside, beneath a silk scarf and compact mirror, was a small, clear vial, unlabeled, half empty. The discovery didn't surprise anyone anymore. It only confirmed what had already been said out loud. "Turn around, please," the officer said. Jesse's breath caught. "This is ridiculous. I'm not a criminal. You don't know what he's like. You think he's some generous, harmless old man, but you didn't live with him. He's ice. You think I'm the monster." Neither officer replied. One stepped behind her gently but firmly, guiding her wrists back. The metallic snap of handcuffs was sudden and final. Jesse flinched at the sound. "You're making a mistake," she said, as they led her toward the exit. "I deserved more than this. I deserved something real." Stephen watched them go without speaking. Ryder looked at him, waiting for some kind of reaction, but there wasn't one. Not yet. Stephen stood there utterly still, while Jesse's voice faded into the background. And when it was quiet again, the entire cafe seemed to let out a collective breath it hadn't realized it was holding. The moment Jesse vanished beyond the cafe gate, flanked by the officers and still spitting broken phrases about what she deserved, the Laurel Garden fell into a hush that felt deeper than silence. It was as if the space itself needed time to comprehend what had just happened. A few chairs scraped softly against the stone floor as patrons began to stand, not in a rush, but in quiet, awkward movements. They were unsure whether to resume their meals or walk away, unsure what the rules were after witnessing something that raw, that real. Phones slipped back into purses. Conversations that resumed did so in soft, hushed tones, as though anyone speaking too loudly might disturb what was left of the moment. Stephen Jones remained where he was standing beside the table, with one hand resting loosely on the back of his chair. His face was calm, but not because he was at peace. It was the calm that followed devastation, the stillness of a man who hadn't yet begun to process the full weight of what he had just lost. The air around him felt heavy, not with embarrassment, but with the strange echo of betrayal. Everything in him seemed to be folding inward. His shoulders had lowered not in surrender, but in exhaustion. He looked down at the bowl of soup, still untouched, the swirl of cream now flattened across the surface, the heat long gone. The faint scent of herbs that once mingled with fresh bread now felt like a cruel afterthought. Ryder stayed where he was. He hadn't moved since the officers had come. His heart was still racing, not from fear anymore, but from the pressure of the moment finally beginning to lift. He didn't know if he was supposed to walk away or if someone would tell him to leave. He had done what he came to do. He had spoken up. And now he was just there, standing a few feet away from the man whose life he might have saved. His arms hung stiffly by his sides, fingers curling and uncurling as he watched Stephen, unsure whether he should say something or wait for permission to speak. Stephen turned his head slowly, just enough to meet Ryder's eyes. There was no trace of suspicion in his gaze anymore. What remained was something quieter, something closer to recognition. He looked at the boy not as a stranger, not as a disruption, but as someone who had shown him a truth no one else would have dared to. Ryder shifted his weight slightly, then spoke in a quiet voice that barely carried across the table. "I didn't mean to ruin everything he said. I just couldn't stay quiet." Stephen studied him for a moment. Then he pulled out the chair across from his and gestured gently. "Sit." The invitation was simple, but it struck Ryder harder than he expected. He hesitated at first, glancing around to see if anyone would object, but the few remaining patrons were busy pretending not to watch. Slowly, cautiously, he walked to the chair and sat down. His back was straight, legs tense, as though ready to leave if this was all a mistake. Stephen sat down across from him. He didn't reach for his phone. He didn't call anyone. He just folded his hands in front of him and exhaled slowly. His voice, when it came, was soft. "You saved my life." Ryder looked down. "I didn't know if you'd believe me." "I didn't either," Stephen said, "at first. But you didn't run. You didn't get louder just to be heard. You just stood there telling the truth." And that was enough. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the leaves above, carrying the low murmur of the street beyond the cafe wall. It was the first natural sound either of them had noticed in what felt like a very long time. Stephen looked at the boy again, this time more closely. "What's your name, Ryder? How long have you been out here?" Ryder's eyes flicked away for a moment. "A while." Stephen didn't press. Instead, he nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of that answer. His gaze fell to the table, and he tapped his fingers once against the glass. "You know," he said quietly, "for a long time, I thought control was the same thing as security. I thought if I made enough money, built enough walls, kept everything clean and predictable, that nothing could surprise me. I thought it made me untouchable." He paused, and Ryder listened, not sure if he was supposed to respond. "But then someone like you shows up." Stephen continued, "Someone who has none of that. No money, no title, no power. And you end up being the only one with enough clarity to say what no one else would." Ryder didn't quite know what to say. He rubbed his hands against the sides of his jeans, the denim ruff under his palms. "It didn't feel brave," he said quietly. "It felt stupid, like maybe I was stepping into something I had no business being in." Stephen let out a soft breath, something close to a chuckle. Most things worth doing feel like that at first. Ryder looked up, and for the first time since all of it began, he allowed himself to exhale. Just a little. The man across from him didn't seem broken exactly, but something inside Stephen had cracked open, and in that space, something better might eventually grow. "I don't know what happens next," Ryder said. Stephen nodded again. "Neither do I. But I know I don't want you going back to the sidewalk." Ryder tilted his head, slightly unsure if he heard that right. Stephen reached into his coat and pulled out a sleek black phone. He tapped a few times, then held it to his ear. His voice, when he spoke into the receiver, was calm but firm. "Yes, I need someone I trust to come to the Laurel Garden right away. No, not for business. For something more important." He paused. "He's a kid. Bring whatever we need. Shelter, food. Let's start there." When he hung up, he met Ryder's eyes again. "Help is coming. And not the kind that disappears in the morning." Ryder stared at him. For a second, the weight of it all caught him off guard. "Why?" he asked. "Why are you helping me?" Stephen leaned back, his eyes darker now, but steadier. "Because you did something most people wouldn't. And because I think you deserve a second chapter. Maybe even more than one." And with that, the two of them sat in the sunlight that was slowly returning to the cafe, the noise of the world beginning to seep back in. The mess was still there, the damage still fresh, but for the first time in a long time there was something else too. There was quiet, there was recognition, and there was at last a beginning. The mess was still there, the damage still fresh, but for the first time in a long time there was something else too. There was quiet, there was recognition, and there was at last a beginning. Stephen leaned back slightly, fingers loosely laced together as he glanced down at the table between them. The linen was still neatly pressed, a half-full glass of water glinting in the light. The soup bowl remained untouched, the surface calm and deceptive, much like the life he had built. After a few seconds of silence, he shifted his gaze back to Ryder and asked quietly, "You mentioned your name was Ryder. Where are you staying?" Ryder hesitated. The question wasn't harsh, wasn't demanding, but it carried weight. He looked down at his hands resting on the edge of the table. His fingernails were chipped. There was dirt under them. He curled his fingers inward, mostly out near Union Street, sometimes behind the bus depot. Depends who else is out there. Stephen didn't flinch. He nodded slowly as though cataloging the information. What about your family, he asked, not like someone checking boxes, but like someone who actually wanted to know. Ryder took a breath. The words came slower now. I lived with my grandma after my mom left. She raised me. Best person I ever knew. She got sick when I was 10. Gone before I turned 12. After that, they tried to put me with someone else, but it didn't work out. I ran. Been on my own since then. Stephen's lips pressed together, his jaw flexing slightly. He exhaled through his nose, quiet but deliberate. How old are you now? 14. Another pause passed between them. Stephen looked at him with new understanding, the kind that didn't just come from sympathy, but from the realization that the kid sitting across from him had lived more life than most grown men ever confront. 14. He repeated softly, almost to himself. Jesus. Ryder shrugged one shoulder, not defensive, just matter of fact. Ain't like anybody asked until now. That line landed harder than it should have. Stephen leaned forward, a little elbows on the table. I'm asking now. Ryder looked up, his eyes dark and steady, not challenging but cautious. Why? Because I saved your life, or because you feel bad? Stephen didn't answer immediately. He let the question breathe between them. Then he said, because I don't think I've ever looked someone like you in the eye long enough to see them, and today you forced me to. So now I want to know. Ryder held his gaze this time. There was no bravado in it, no pride. Just a quiet sort of assessment, the kind that said he was used to being let down, but was always watching in case this time was different. Stephen sat back again, reaching for his glass, but not drinking. You said you ran from the system. Have you tried getting help again? Ryder shook his head. A few times. They want paperwork, ID, proof I belong somewhere. I don't have any of that. Once I tried to get into a shelter, and the guy at the door told me to come back with a parent. Stephen sighed, rubbing a hand along the side of his face. That's ridiculous. That's real, Ryder replied. They don't want kids like me. They want the kind who fit in and don't scare the donors. That stung. Not because it was rude, but because Stephen knew it wasn't wrong. He'd sat in on enough charity boards and funding meetings to know what the phrase public image really meant. He looked at Ryder again and asked, then why speak up? You could have walked away. No one would have blamed you. Ryder hesitated, then answered honestly, because if I didn't and something happened to you, I'd have to live with that, and I already live with enough. Stephen nodded slowly, deeply. That's more integrity than most people I've known, with 1,000 times more privilege. For a while, neither of them spoke. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was just quiet in a way that allowed space for everything unspoken to settle. Around them, the cafe had almost returned to normal. Waiters moved in cautious steps. Dishes clinked gently. The world kept turning even after it nearly stopped. Stephen looked toward the gate, then back at Ryder. Would you be open to meeting someone, not a cop, not a bureaucrat, a friend of mine? She works with kids who've fallen through the cracks. She doesn't ask for ID. Just honesty. Ryder narrowed his eyes. She going to ship me somewhere? Stephen shook his head. She won't do anything you don't agree to, but she's helped a lot of people find their footing. Ryder didn't respond right away. He looked down at the table again, fingers tracing the faint water ring from Stephen's glass. When he finally spoke, it was quiet. Okay, I'll meet her. But if she talks to me like I'm broken, I'm out. Stephen almost smiled, but not with amusement, with respect. Fair enough? Fair enough. Stephen glanced down at his watch and gave a slight nod as if confirming something. Then he stood up, slowly reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone once more. Ryder watched him tense but not frightened. He wasn't sure why his chest felt tight again. It wasn't fear this time, more like the anticipation of something he didn't know how to name. Stephen stepped away from the table slightly and made a quiet call, speaking into the phone in a voice too low for Ryder to make out. He only caught a few words, yes now, and then a pause, and then he agreed to meet. When Stephen returned to his seat, his voice was calm. She'll be here in 10 minutes. Her name's Grace. She doesn't wear suits, doesn't carry a clipboard. She's practical, honest, and she's not going to push you into anything. Ryder didn't answer, but his eyes narrowed slightly. There was no rejection in his expression, just careful consideration, like someone who had heard promises before and was still deciding if this one should matter. He leaned forward a little, elbows on the table, hands folded together like he was anchoring himself to something stable. Most people, he said, slowly show up for 5 minutes. They say the right words, they act all caring, and then they bounce when it gets messy. Stephen nodded, accepting the truth of it. Grace doesn't bounce. The minutes that followed were slow and strangely quiet. The patio had cleared out more by now, just a few lingering patrons pretending not to glance over, and the staff gave the corner table a respectful distance. Stephen and Ryder sat in relative silence. There was no pressure to speak. The weight of what had happened still hung in the air, but it had shifted less like a storm and more like a calm after one. Ryder sat with his arms crossed loosely, eyes watching the entrance. Stephen sipped his water one slow drink at a time, his thoughts clearly still turning behind his expression. Then, just as Stephen looked up, a woman stepped through the gate. She was in her early 50s jeans and a dark green sweater, her hair pulled back in a short braid. She walked with purpose, but without tension. No clipboard, no briefcase, just a cloth shoulder bag slung across her chest, and a face that looked like it had seen a lot and still stayed soft. Stephen stood up, and she gave him a quick nod. No handshake, no preamble. "Is this him?" she asked plainly, looking toward Ryder. "Yes," Stephen said. "This is Ryder." Grace turned her gaze to the boy. She didn't offer her hand. She didn't smile wide or give a speech. She simply looked at him and said, "Hey, you good to talk?" Ryder blinked. He wasn't used to that. Not the tone, not the words, no sugarcoating. Just a question asked like his answer mattered. He gave a small nod. "Yeah, I guess." Grace moved to the seat beside him, not across. She didn't sit immediately. She dropped her bag on the ground, crouched beside the chair, and said, "Mind if I sit here? Not trying to be in your space." Ryder looked at her, then shrugged. "Go ahead." She sat, adjusted her sweater, and leaned slightly forward, elbows on her knees. "So, I hear you saw something today." That right, Ryder glanced at Stephen, who gave no signal one way or another. Then he nodded. "Yeah, I saw her put something in the soup." Grace nodded, no surprise, no reaction beyond acknowledgement. Takes guts to say something when nobody else will. "You've got people watching out for you." Ryder gave a quick small shake of his head. "No, it's just me." Grace looked at him a little longer, then asked, "Do you want that to change?" He didn't answer immediately. He looked down at his shoes. The laces were uneven. One shoe had a tear in the side. He picked at it with his thumb. "Depends on what it means." Grace didn't rush. "It means you get a roof, food, a place where you don't have to watch your back all night, a bed that's yours, not borrowed, and some people who don't walk away when things get hard. That's what I'm offering. No tricks, no lock-ins. But I don't sugarcoat either. There's rules. There's structure. You'd be around other kids, some with rough edges like you. We don't fix people, but we help them find their footing. You up for something like that?" Ryder lifted his eyes slowly. "You gonna make me pray or talk about my trauma every day?" Grace cracked a small grin. "Not unless you want to. We're not in the business of forcing healing on people. We just make room for it." Ryder leaned back, took a breath. He looked at Stephen again. She for real. Stephen met his gaze without hesitation. "She's the best person I know." That answer did more than any pitch. Ryder nodded once slowly. "Okay, I'll try it." Grace stood up and stretched her back. "Cool. We'll keep it simple. I'll drive you over. You get a look at the place. If you want to stay, we'll figure out the rest. If not, I'll bring you right back here. No hard feelings." Ryder stood as well. He pulled his hoodie sleeves down and adjusted his shoulders like he was trying to remember how to stand tall in front of someone who might actually see him. Stephen stepped forward and offered a folded piece of paper. "It's a number," he said. "Mine. Call if you need anything. Doesn't matter what time." Ryder hesitated before taking it. He tucked it into the front pocket of his hoodie. "Thanks." Stephen nodded. "No, thank you." Grace waited beside the gate, hands in her jacket pockets, letting the boy take his time. Ryder gave the cafe one last glance. The table, the empty bowl, the people who weren't there anymore. Then he walked toward her. As they stepped outside together, the light caught the edge of his face. And for the first time that day, he didn't look like someone on the edge of a world that didn't want him. He looked like someone stepping into something unknown but possible. The late afternoon light had shifted, casting long, warm shadows across the stone patio of the Laurel Garden. Most of the tables were empty now, and the air had taken on a quieter rhythm, one that didn't feel urgent or strained. Inside the cafe, a few servers cleared glassware with the kind of silence that came not from fear, but from reverence, as if they too had absorbed the weight of what had transpired. Outside, just past the black iron gate, 3 people stood without speaking. Stephen Ryder and Grace the woman who had arrived not as a savior, but as a witness who knew when to step in and when to simply stand by. Ryder shifted his backpack higher on his shoulder, a simple canvas bag that had seen too much rain and not enough rest. His hoodie still hung loose on his frame, but something in the way he stood had changed. His shoulders were no longer pulled forward in defense. His head was level. His feet were grounded. He glanced to his right where Grace stood, her posture relaxed, one hand in her coat pocket, the other loosely holding a manila folder she hadn't opened since she arrived. She wasn't pushing him, just giving him room to decide. Stephen stood to his left, hands tucked into his coat, not speaking either, letting the silence settle with them like an old friend. It was Ryder who broke it. What if I mess this up? His voice wasn't small. It wasn't even scared. It was honest more than anything. I mean, I want to try, but what if it's not enough? What if I don't know how to be better? Stephen turned slightly, his face calm but intent, like he was answering something deeper than the question itself. "You're not starting from zero," he said. "You stood up when everyone else looked away. That's not nothing. That's something most grown men can't do." Grace nodded slowly. "We don't expect perfect," she added. "We don't even expect quick. We expect effort. And when effort falls short, we expect honesty. You've already shown you've got that." Ryder exhaled through his nose, not quite a sigh, more like his lungs needed to clear space for what was coming next. He looked down the street, then back at the cafe, his eyes landing on the now empty table where the soup had sat untouched. He didn't speak, but he didn't walk away either. That meant something. Stephen noticed the glance. "You don't have to say goodbye to that place like it was something that belonged to you," he said. "You changed what it meant just by walking in. It's not just for them anymore." Ryder looked at him, blinking against the bright light. "I don't want it to be about that place. I just want what comes next to mean something. I'm tired of moving without going anywhere." Grace stepped forward, then not interrupting, but joining. "Then let's take the first step. Not all of them, just one." The 3 of them began walking. Not fast, not like people in a hurry to escape a scene. They moved together side by side, like it had already been decided, not in words, but in actions, glances, the mutual understanding that none of them could go back to before. Ryder stayed in the middle, not because anyone told him to, but because it felt right. He wasn't trailing behind. He wasn't being led. He belonged to the space between. As they reached the corner, a man who had been sitting earlier on the cafe's far side glanced up from his phone. He recognized Ryder not as a kid to avoid, not as a stranger to fear, but as the boy who had raised his voice when no one else dared. The man gave a short nod, not dramatic, just respectful. Ryder caught it and nodded back, his face unreadable but steady. It was the smallest exchange, but it carried the weight of something earned. They kept walking. The city noise returned soft at first, then rising the sound of tires against pavement, the beep of a crossing light, laughter from a passing group of teens. Ryder heard it all differently now. It didn't drown him. It surrounded him like proof that the world was still turning, and maybe this time it had room for him in it. When they reached the car, just an ordinary sedan, not black-tinted or flashy, Grace opened the back door, but didn't usher him in. She looked at him levelly. "You don't have to come with me today. We can schedule something. Let you think about it. But if you're ready, there's a bed waiting. Clean clothes, food, someone to talk to who doesn't have a clipboard." Ryder didn't look at the car. He looked at Stephen. "You coming?" Stephen shook his head. "Not this trip. But I'll check in. And if you want, we can grab lunch next week. No soup, I promise." Ryder cracked the faintest smile. It didn't last long, but it didn't have to. It was real. He nodded once, then turned back to Grace. "Okay." He slid into the back seat, the door closing with a soft, certain click. Grace rounded the front, and Stephen stepped back onto the curb, watching them go, not like someone being left behind, but like someone sending something off the right way. As the car pulled into traffic, Stephen stood still for a long time, his hands in his pockets, his eyes on the space the car had just occupied. Then finally he turned and began walking the other direction, not toward the cafe, toward something else. Back inside the Laurel Garden, the table was clear. The soup had been taken away, the linens replaced, but the space it left behind still held weight, a lesson, a moment, a reminder. And in the back seat of that simple car, Ryder leaned his head against the window. He didn't close his eyes. He didn't need to. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't watching for exits. He was letting the road carry him forward. Sometimes the people who stand outside the lines are the ones who draw them straighter, and sometimes the smallest voice in the room is the only one telling the truth. Ryder's voice wasn't loud, it wasn't trained, but it was clear, it was brave. And that day, it changed 2 lives. And maybe, just maybe, it started something even bigger.
Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.